The League of Nations awarded the Mandate of Mesopotamia to Britain at the San Remo Conference in 1920. Arab and Kurdish nationalists discovered, much to their surprise, that after fighting the Ottomans and then the Turks, they had exchanged one foreign ruler for another. During the war, Percy Cox had served as the highest non-military official in British-occupied Mesopotamia, assisted by Arnold Wilson and Gertrude Bell. 1 month after the armistice with Germany, Cox sent Wilson to meet with Kurdish leaders in Sulaymaniyah. They implored him to partition the Mandate, carving an independent Kurdistan out of northern Mesopotamia, but they were rebuffed. The British only offered the Kurds vaguely autonomous statehood within the Mesopotamia Mandate. Cox appointed Mahmud Barzani of the Barzani clan governor of Sulaymaniyah. Kurdish authorities answered the gesture by seizing British officials, and Barzani declared himself King of Kurdistan. The British had lost 250,000 troops in Mesopotamia in World War I. If Kurdistan were allowed its independence, even as a mandate, the British worried that Mesopotamia would fall into disarray, as every tribal, ethnic, and religious minority cited its unique identity, pushing conflicting claims for new mandates. They were not about to give up the territory they had bled for without a fight. Winston Churchill, Britain's war secretary, advocated dropping mustard gas on the Kurds to terrorize them into submission, but logistical and ethical constraints won out. Instead of dropping gas, the British relied on two groups to put down the revolt: troops flown in from British India and the levies, a multi-ethnic, multi-religious security force first created by the British military to fight the Turks in 1915. The British suppressed the rebellion in a little over a month. Barzani was arrested and initially sentenced to death, but colonial authorities did not want to turn him into a martyr. They rescinded the order, and in August they exiled him to India. Less than a year later, in July 1920, 62 Kurds gathered together to declare an independent mandate of Kurdistan within the British Empire. This time the Kurds were joined by the native Arab population in a much larger rebellion against British rule. Arabs in Rumaitha, Shamia, and Ad-Daghra attacked British soldiers. Ayatollah Muhammad Taqi al-Shirazi, the most powerful Shia figure in Mesopotamia, and Muhammad as-Sadr of the powerful Sadr clan, crossed religious lines and called on Shia Arabs to pray with their Sunni brethren, an unprecedented act of ecumenical nationalism. The British had united the Arabs of Mesopotamia in opposition to British rule. 4 secret societies conspired against the Ottomans: the Party of Islamic Enlightenment, the Muslim National League, the Guardians of Independence, and the Covenant of Iraq. Now they fought against the British. A prominent Arab of Jabal Shammar, Sheikh al-Dari, murdered the highest-ranking British official in southern Iraq, Gerard Leachman, inspiring an outbreak of destructive rioting and more violence. Leachman was supposed to have made peace with the Arabs, but he was arrogant and rude to everyone, which cost him his life and made it impossible for the British to negotiate with the societies, the tribes, religious authorities, or principled Iraqi nationalists, all of whom had assembled against British colonialism. With Leachman's death, diplomacy gave way to war. Putting down the Arab revolt required more men and more money than the British had expected. Something had to be done to placate Mesopotamian nationalists. In neighboring Syria, Faisal ibn Hussein had only managed to serve as king for 5 months when the French overthrew him, but the British found no fault in his governance. A king without a country suddenly found a country in need of a king. At the CAIRO conference in 1921, British diplomats appointed the deposed Syrian ruler, Faisal I, king of Iraq, using him as a figurehead to legitimize their hold over Iraq while placating the Hashemites, who were upset that they had lost their hold in Syria. What the British didn't know was that Faisal had corresponded with Jemal Pasha and Mustafa Kemal to form a united front against the French. Faisal was not a bystander to the events occurring around him. He was not going to kowtow to British directives. In 1921, the Turks invaded and occupied Rovanduz, and in 1922 they took Khoi, Khaladiza, and Rania. British forces fled Sulaymaniyah. Britain was on the verge of losing Kurdistan for the 3rd time in 3 years. The situation was so desperate that the British brought back Mahmud Barzani, hoping that after threatening to kill him and exiling him for 3 years, he would be more amenable to their position. He wasn't. He went right back to fighting the British. The British bombed the Kurds, the Turks, and the Arabs into submission, sending Barzani across the mountainous Persian border. After so much trouble, they finally enjoyed a few relative successes. Faisal and the British codified Iraq's submission in the Anglo-Iraqi Treaties of Alliance, legally guaranteeing the Royal Air Force access to bases at Habbaniyah and Shayba for decades. In 1921, Ibn Saud defeated Rashidi forces at Ha'il, eliminating Jabal Shammar, but he advanced no further, leaving Anbar to the British. In 1927, after more than a decade of searching, Iraq finally struck oil at Baba Gurgur. For the next 20 years, Baba Gurgur was the world's largest known oil reserve. An international consortium led by Standard Oil built a pipeline from Kirkuk through British-run Transjordan and Palestine. France, which had been promised Mosul at Sykes-Picot, settled for a quarter of Iraq's oil production. European powers now had an alternative to the reliance on the world's great oil power, the United States. But all was not well in Iraq. Mahmud Barzani took up arms again in 1927, and again on September 11, 1930, demanding Kurdistan's independence. He fought on until May 1931. The British captured him a second time, keeping him under house arrest until 1935. Arresting Barzani did not have the desired effect. Ahmed Barzani and his younger brother Mustafa, members of the Barzani tribe who were unrelated to Mahmud, launched their own insurgency against the British, and Kurds in neighboring countries were just as determined. In 1925, Sheikh Said, a Kurdish Islamist, tried to set up his own Kurdish caliphate in Turkey. In 1928, there was another Kurdish uprising in Turkey, and in 1930, Kurds in Turkey and Iran united behind Hoybun, a nationalist group. In Iran, Simko Shikak of the Shakak Kurds bedeviled both the Iranian government and the local Assyrian Christian community from 1920 to 1930. Killing Shikak was similarly ineffectual. A year after his death, Jafar Sultan launched another Kurdish-Iranian revolt. From 1936 to 1938, Kurds in Turkey, subject to forced internal relocation, violently resisted the Turkish government. Kurdistan was a dream that would not die for Kurds in Iraq as well as its neighbors. The Kurds never succeeded and were none too pleased when the British relinquished Iraq, leaving the Kurds to answer to Baghdad. In 1932, Britain granted Iraq its independence, confident they could trust Faisal to respect past agreements and maintain public order. A year later, he died, and his 21-year-old son, Ghazi bin Faisal, ascended to the throne. Iraqi independence posed a new Mosul question. Absent British protection, how could the Christian Assyrian minority trust the government to protect their community? Simon Eshai, the leader of the Assyrian community, threatened to turn the levies, a British Assyrian security force, into an independent army. Fearing northern secession, the government summoned Eshai to Baghdad and exiled him to Cyprus. The levies drew men from several northern communities, like the Shabak and Turkmen, but they were largely comprised of Assyrian Christians, a community that never got along with its Kurdish neighbors. In 1834, Botan, a Kurdish empire backed by the Ottomans, exterminated 7,000 to 10,000 Assyrians in fear of Assyrian nationalism. In 1895, Kurds backed by the Ottomans murdered 25,000 Assyrians and Armenians. The Ottomans murdered 150 to 300,000 Assyrians amid the larger genocide against the Armenians during World War I. After World War I, 20,000 Assyrians left Anatolia and came south to Mosul. The levies played a major role in suppressing Kurdish nationalism in 1919, and the Kurds never forgave them. General Bakr Sidki, an Iraqi of mixed Arab and Kurdish ancestry, organized a genocidal campaign against the Assyrians, killing 3,000 in the SIMELE genocide. 2 years later, the Shia, Kurdish, and Yazidi communities rebelled, and again, Sidki used mass murder to force submission. In 1936, Sidki seized power in a coup, but less than a year later he was assassinated. Before he died, he signed the Sadr-Abad Pact, a 5-year non-aggression pact with Iran, Afghanistan, and Turkey. Non-signatories notably included Hashemite Jordan and British-dominated Egypt and Kuwait. Sidki's brief tenure steered Iraq away from Britain and its allies. Ghazi returned to power, but he too died in a car crash in 1939, leaving his 4-year-old son, Faisal II, on the throne. Iraqis widely suspected that the car accident was actually an assassination. Ghazi had used his position to preach anti-British, pro-Nazi propaganda and withdrew recognition of Kuwait's independence, insisting Britain had split Kuwait from Iraq. Faisal's uncle, Abdullah, ruled as regent for 2 years until pro-Nazi army officers, the Golden Square, seized power. Former Prime Minister Rashid Ali al-Gailani now led the National Defense Government. His forces tried to evict the Royal Air Force from Habbaniyah, but his war rebellion was put down in 2 months. Faisal returned to power, with Nouri as-Said as his prime minister. Faisal was still a child, so his uncle Abdullah and as-Said effectively ruled the country as a partnership, with genuine respect for Faisal's royal inheritance once he came of age. Removing Gailani's regime repaired relations with the British. As-Said had negotiated the Anglo-Iraqi Treaty of Submission during an earlier stint as prime minister, and Abdullah was grateful for British assistance in restoring his family to the throne. Resentment over the British Air Force's limitless access to air bases, the enduring damage of the Baghdad Pact, and even more Kurdish rebellions weakened the monarchy after World War II.